Now, moving on to the actual first bill put forward by the U.S. Senate, again showing us that what they're doing has absolutely nothing to do with Americans. This coming from The Intercept, again shared with me today by Marshall. Appreciate that. U.S. Senate's first bill in midst of shutdown is a bipartisan defense of the Israeli government from boycotts. And again, remember, this is something, not just me, many people have been warning about. Them clearly trying to slip this in and doing it with as little fanfare as possible. They just like the Manager Wolves Act, just like the Farm Bill. This is how our politicians operate. They do things not based on what Americans want, but what on their special interests want. And they do so secretly as much as possible, so not to get people like us speaking up and saying, this is absolutely absurd. To do any kind of a bill that's not only unconstitutional, but says that we're not allowed to do something against a foreign nation. And of course, Israel being an important part of this. Now, in the 2019 GOP-controlled Senate, this first bill that's being considered is not designed to protect American workers, bolster U.S. companies, or address the various debates over border security and immigration. It's not a bill to open the government that's currently shut down. Instead, according to multiple sources involved in the legislative process, S1, the first bill, will be a compendium containing a handful of foreign policy-related measures, which we briefly touched on at the beginning as well, a main one of which is a provision with Florida's GOP Senator Marco Rubio as the lead sponsor to defend the Israeli government. The bill is a top legislative priority for AIPAC, not a big surprise, which, if you're not familiar, is the Israeli lobby. We've also talked about these people aggressively and illegally in many ways focusing on anti-BDS protesters, even though that's their constitutional right, and doing so in many ways that would scare you, that we've touched on previous shows. And now we have our own politicians making sure this is the very first thing. With all that we're suffering in this country, with all the many things that, like I pointed out, that Americans would stand up and say, this is what's most important, that's what they think is most important. And that should resonate with Americans. Now, in the previous Congress, that measure in regard to Israel and boycott BDS, anti-BDS, was known as S-170. And it gives the state and local governments explicit legal authority to boycott any U.S. companies which themselves are participating in a boycott of Israel and BDS. As we just reported, 26 states currently have enacted some version of a law to punish or otherwise sanction entities which participate in or support the boycott of Israel, which is unconstitutional at its basis level, while similar laws are pending in at least 13 other states. Now, Rubio's bill is designed to strengthen the legal basis to defend those Israel-protecting laws from constitutional challenge. Again, recognize what that's saying. That despite the fact that this is as quintessentially unconstitutional, to say that we're not allowed to boycott something, anything, that's our right. And now our own Congress is passing laws to make sure that they cannot come at this from a constitutional challenge. It's everything else we're talking about. The Farm Bill, as I keep bringing up, is a perfect example. That they're literally going through their channels to make sure that we or other Congress members cannot take actions to stop or do things that Americans actually want. Now, punishment aimed at companies which choose to boycott Israel can also sweep up individual Americans in its punitive net, as the article puts it, because individual contractors often work for state or local governments under the auspices of a sole proprietorship or some other business entity. And as we also recently discussed, as the article points out, that was the case with Texas elementary school speech pathologist Bahia Amawi, the teacher who lost her job for refusing to sign a pledge to Israel, which is absolutely absurd. And she worked with autistic and speech-impaired children in Austin. And because she refused to promise not to boycott goods produced in Israel or illegal Israeli settlements, she lost her job. You might ask yourself, how does that even relate? Well, it's a good question, because it doesn't at all. The point is, this is infiltrating every aspect of our society. Now, thus far, the two federal courts that have ruled on such bills as this have declared them to be unconstitutional violations of the First Amendment, or speech rights of American citizens. Both times. And that's why they're coming at it from this angle, to make sure that you can no longer challenge it on a constitutional level. Now, these are the Israeli defending free speech punishing laws, which Rubio's bill is designed to strengthen. These kind of laws that both the courts recently said were unconstitutional. Now, although Rubio is the chief sponsor, his bill attracted broad bipartisan support. Both sides of the false two-party paradigm, Republicans and Democrats, all support this, as is true of most bills designed to protect Israel and which are supported by AIPAC. It's bipartisan because it's infiltrated our entire policy, our entire political system today. It's very similar in regard to war. That's why we see the entirety of our Congress saying, no, we need to stay in Syria. We see both Fox and CNN saying, no, we need to stay in Syria, when they said absolutely nothing about when we went to Syria and initiated this illegal war. Now, last year, Senator Cardin introduced a bill that would have actually criminalized participation in international boycotts of Israel, and it was on the verge of passing, which we talked about, with significant bipartisan support until the ACLU sounded the alarm on how incredibly unconstitutional it was. And again, regardless of each of these steps being shot down as roundly unconstitutional, these very same congresspeople that are supposed to be representing Americans continue to drive this forward. Ask yourself why. Clearly, there's reasons other than what's best for this country. Now, that the newly elected 116th United States Congress would consciously choose to prioritize protection of Israel at the expense of the constitutional rights of Americans, and over countless bills, and just general topics that would help Americans, should really highlight the real collusion taking place, the real danger to our democracy. And I'll tell you, it's not Russia, at least not to this obvious and invasive a degree. ACLU Senior Legislative Counsel Kathleen Ruan told The Intercept, quote, "In the midst of a partial government shutdown, Democratic and Republican senators have decided that one of their first orders of business next week should be to sneak through, and that's important, to sneak through a bill that would weaken Americans' First Amendment protections, in particular about Israel, not just in general, but only when it's about Israel. You can boycott anything else, but not Israel." Very telling. She goes on to say, the bill, Combating BDS Act, is what it's actually called, encourages states to adopt the very same anti-boycott laws that two federal courts blocked on First Amendment grounds. The legislation, like the unconstitutional state anti-boycott laws it condones, sends a message to Americans that they will be penalized if they dare to disagree with their government. You know, what the very thing the people are supposed to do. Speak truth to power. Question their government. That's quintessentially American, and now they're passing laws to take that away, which is everything that's been happening over the last so many decades, or even further. Now, she goes on to finish, "We therefore urge senators to vote no on the Combating BDS Act next week." So please, if you feel like it will make a difference, and it often does, maybe not in the ways that I would like, but it can, please call your congressman. Call your congresswoman. Call anybody you think it'll make a difference and tell them why this is unconstitutional. Tell them everything we just discussed. Send them this video. Make sure people are aware of what this is about. And it's not even, it really is about Israel. But taking Israel out of the conversation, this is about your constitutional rights being violated for the benefit of a foreign country. Very simple.